Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the show on this January 22nd, a Sunday. This is storytelling time. Now, I'm going to tell you a story about happened years and years ago. I think it was the winter of 1967, but it might have been the winter of 1966. Not exactly sure. But what was happening was my father and my mother were living in Nova Scotia. And there wasn't an awful lot of work in Nova Scotia for my father. My father was a trained welder. He'd been trained from a company, I think, called Fruhoff Trailer, trained as a welder. And also, he's a trained auto body repairman. But there wasn't an awful lot of work in Nova Scotia. My father decided to build a house that summer. Early in the spring, he'd started to build a house. I remember he was digging, doing everything himself. Even digging the foundation, pouring the foundation all spring. And I was only about 4 years old, or maybe 4.5 years old. And my mother was there helping him side by side, and digging in that red clay mud, mosquitoes everywhere. And so he got some guy down the road to bring in a tractor to help him. The tractor had some sort of a homemade plow in the back of it. And I guess he was like my father, and he was helping along just to. Anyway, they're building this house. My father was building this house. So he worked at it all summer and into the fall. And it was only a small house. So by the time fall come, he was getting it nearly completed. And we moved right in. We had a small travel trailer, and me, my mother, and my father moved right into the house, but kind of lived out of the travel trailer and lived out of the house simultaneously while the house was being finished. So during that period in time, my grandfather had already moved down to Florida. He'd moved down to a place called Hollywood, Florida, and he was living in a trailer park. And my grandfather, he was into television repair, and it was very good money. Back in those days, they used to repair the televisions. They just didn't throw them out like they do now, because they were a very expensive item for a household to purchase back in those days. And oftentimes they were small, and oftentimes they were color televisions. A 19-inch screen was considered to be a big television back in those days, because they had the big picture tubes and everything. So my grandfather was a television repairman, and he was a bit of a rotund sort of a fella, a little bit overweight, He always was a happy man, and he enjoyed his work, and he was making good money. So he got talking to my father over the telephone, and my father would phone him up and talk to him and everything. He was telling my dad, "Oh, it's so great down here in Florida, it's sunny every day, and I got lots of work, and I'm making all kinds of money, and you should come down," to my dad. My dad was like, he's listening to him, but he was building his house. He's fairly much enjoying, but he's listening to what my grandfather was saying. So they were good friends, my grandfather and my dad. My grandfather kept communicating with my dad up north in Nova Scotia, telling him how great it was, and how cheap things were, and how much money you made, and how cheap rent was. He says it's only $25 a month here, and water, you get water and electricity for that in this trailer park. And he says, I bought this little trailer, he says, and I only paid $400 for it. He says, you should come down to my dad. He says, oh, it's just great, you have your own little patio in front. You have all these flowers put. He says, you should see it. He showed pictures to my. He showed my dad, sent a picture in the mail, a postcard, and my dad was looking at this stuff and saying, oh boy, this does sound pretty good, no more winter. So fall was setting in that year. I think it was 1967. Fall was setting in, and my dad was working on the finishing parts of the house. It was getting late in the fall, toward winter time, and it's starting to get really cold. And getting some cold snaps in there, And so one day, now I'm going to tell you something about my dad. My dad, he used to curse when he'd ever, especially when he'd hurt himself or something wasn't going right. Say he was working on the car or something, and a wrench would slip and he'd bust his knuckles or whatever. He used to be able to put these curse words together like you wouldn't believe. But he'd never say the word F U, the word, the 4 letter word, the F word. He'd never say that. But all kinds of bitches, hells, dams, shits, he'd put them together in different arrangements. He had style at this, you know what I mean? But it would only last for about a minute while he was really upset. Maybe if he banged his thumb or something like that, or something didn't go right on a mechanic job or something like that, and that would set him off. And it'd be about a tirade of about 30 seconds or maybe a minute of this dams and hells and cursing and whatever. Generally at a vehicle, but this time wasn't at a vehicle. This time he was up on the roof of his house finishing it off, and he was buying these parts cheap to build his house. He was getting them for almost nothing. He'd drive into Dartmouth with an old trailer and he'd pick up things like shingles that had been on somebody else's roof, old barn boards, whatever he could find to build this house. But he was getting to the final stages of getting this house completed. So he was up on the roof, and it was winter time. Pretty much winter, like I think it was around December, 1st of December, but it set in really cold, really, really cold, bone-chillingly cold, and he was up there on that roof, and he was hammering these shingles in. And shingles already had the holes in them from where they'd been pulled off of somebody else's roof. So he's hammering one of these, and he must have hit a knot or something with the roofing nail. It must have slipped out from under his fingers. And he slammed the hammer down on his finger. Boom, bang. Well, he was already very uncomfortable because up there on the roof and the wind's blowing and the chill's going right through you, and there's snow in the air and snow sticking to the roof. And his legs are perched around the peak of the roof, and the roof's digging into his legs, and he's all cramped up there and cold and shivering and everything else. And now he bangs his hand with the hammer. All this big long line of cursing comes out. Damn, sir, that's never heard the end of it, and drops his hammer down, and he slid down off the roof, and he comes inside the house, and he says to my mother, he says, "That's it. That's it. That's it." She says, "What's it?" He says, "That's it." He says, "I'm going to Florida." And she says, "We're going to Florida?" He says, "Yeah, we're going to Florida." Well, I guess what had happened was my mother generally, she wouldn't take a back seat to my dad, And my mother, generally, she made a lot of the decisions. But I guess probably what had happened is my mother had been talking to my grandfather as well. And so I think, now I don't know this for sure, but I think she might have been happy about my dad making that decision. So she says, okay, we're going to Florida. So what do we do about the house? And I guess they came to the decision, well, we'll just sell it. Go finish it off, put the last shingles up on the roof. My dad was like, okay, I'll do that. We'll finish it off and we'll sell it. And we'll go to Florida. So how are we going to go to Florida was the next thing. My dad and my mother, they talked it out, and they asked my grandfather and everything, and they couldn't figure out how to do it. Oh, well, they did figure it out and eventually, and it was to apply for a green card. So my dad sent in the application, and he was waiting in the mail. And every day he'd go to the mailbox, when's it coming? And the weather was getting colder and colder. He was more and more uncomfortable, but he was already made up his mind he was going to go. He's going to get out of there. And so he was like, every day, oh, when's it coming? My mother, when's it coming? I don't know, she'd say. I don't know when it's coming. It's coming soon. And he kept getting more and more anxious as the days went by, as the weeks went by, and after a while, as the months started to go by. Well, it was getting to be the middle of winter, around January, and my father just couldn't take it anymore. He started calling different government agencies to try to figure out why is this thing taking so long? And what happened was he ended up calling his member of parliament. And he got talking to the member of parliament. The member of parliament says, I'll see what I can do. Well, it wasn't long. It was only a couple weeks later. It came in the mail. And my dad was like, oh boy, look to my mother, look, it's here, it's here. All happy and everything, right? Well, in the meantime, what had been happening was, it was my first year in school. And I remember when I started going to school that year, in first grade. I think it was either first grade or kindergarten. I think it was first grade, to tell you the truth. I was 5 years old. The kids have been awful brutal there at that school. It was a brick schoolhouse. It had about maybe 5 or 6 classrooms in it, you know. And they used to bus us about 3 or 4 miles to school. And I remember one of my memories, and I was only 5 years old, so it's hard for me to remember. But one of my memories, I remember them kicking me down into a puddle, and the frozen ice was over the puddle like a thick layer of frozen ice. And you ever seen those puddles, when they got a frozen layer of ice and kids stomp on them and they break like glass? It's like breaking glass. Well, they had me down on one of those puddles and they were stomping on my hand and using my hand to break the ice with. I remember that. And of course, that's one of the things you never forget, being beat up by a bunch of bullies, And that's how it was for me in school. But it wasn't bad enough. These snotty-nosed kids at that school, my first year there, gave me everything that was going. Starting early in the fall, First, I think I caught the measles. And then I got the mumps. And then I got the worst flu you had ever seen. A horrible flu. And then after that, I got the whooping cough. Coughing all night long, night after night. And even a little bit of blood started to come up. My mother was taking me to the doctors. And, the doctors didn't know what to do. And I was getting sicker and skinnier and sicker and skinnier. These viruses, one after another, were attacking me. And I was one sick little boy. And my father knew that, and he was worried about me. My mother was terrible worried about me. Didn't know what to do. Neither one of them knew what to do except to take me to the doctor. So, come a time was, my bowels started not to function properly because I was so weak and sick. My bowels weren't even working. So I went about 10 days without any poop. My mother was on the phone to my grandfather down in Florida. My grandfather down in Florida, he was kind of the head of the family. He always knew what to do in any situation, So he said to my mother, he said, oh, this is terrible. He hasn't pooped in how long? She's like, 10 days. So what happened? What did the doctor say? He asked her. And the doctor said, well, maybe it's normal for him. My grandfather said, that ain't normal for nobody. Everybody's got to poop. He'll die if he don't poop. So what happened was my grandfather said, he said, listen, he said to my mother, you got to give that boy an enema. She says, I can't do that. I can't give him an enema. She says, oh yes, you must. He said, he's going to die if you don't. He said, doctors don't know what to do, and they're no help. He said, and he's gonna explode. So with all that pooping, he's got 10 days. He hasn't went 10. How long? 10 days. Says you got to give him an enema. He said, listen. He said, and he told her how to do it. He said, go to the drugstore. You get one of these. They used to have in those days these rubber bags, enema bags, and a long cord that came off of them, and this thing. It looked like I don't know what. He said you got to do it, and he told her how to do it. So my mother gave me an enema. It did move me a little bit. Got a little bit of that out in the rocks. That's what was coming out, rocks. So anyway, so I was a very sick little boy. What I remember, though, was how that winter, how gray and dark and dreary it was, and how sick I was. I was fever every night, coughing all night long, not getting any sleep. And this constant ache in my bowels because my bowels just weren't working, and I was just a mess, total mess. Skinny little kid, weak, skinny, The viruses, they look for they're like a predator. They're like a viruses are like a wolf. They'll look for the weak one in the flock and then tear him to pieces. And that's what the viruses were trying to do to me. It got me down weak and sickly, and it just kept coming. They just kept coming, these viruses. So I think it was the whooping cough. It was the one I had then. And I was just starting to get a little bit toward the end of getting over it, you know what I mean? But not really. So I left for Florida. The day come, and I packed everything up into an old Chevy, you know. I had a big back seat in it. Everything was packed into the trunk. All my parents' belongings and everything, a lot of their stuff, was packed in the trunk. And they headed to Florida. And I remember what it was like driving out of there. Snow up to your neck. I remember driving through Nova Scotia, heading to New Brunswick, and the snow was up around the tops of the telephone poles, around the sides of the telephone poles, and drifts. It was up the whole sides of the telephone poles. And on the ground, it must have been 5 or 6 feet deep. All over the farmers' fields, and the gray colors. The sky was gray and dark, and there was no sun. There hadn't been sun for weeks. Just constant storms and snow, and this deep snow everywhere, driving through. And I remember looking out the window, and my mother, she had me bundled up, bundled up with about 10 layers, because the heater didn't work that good in that car. I was in the back seat, sitting across the seat, and I was so bundled up I couldn't even move properly. I couldn't even hardly turn my head. About 5 scarves around my neck, about 4 toques on my head, those stocking caps. All my stocking caps are pulled down almost over my eyes, and the scarves are all the way up to my nose. And so I was just looking out through a slit, and I turned my head this way and look out the window, and I seen the trees going by, and all this drifts and drifts of deep snow, And the car just kept moving. My dad had his pedal put on that pedal, and he had that old car just to go in his old Chevy. I think it was a 327 V8 in the thing, and he had her just humming down those roads, He was just like a horse. You know how a horse is when it's on its way home? That's how he was getting out of there. So, anyway, it wasn't long, and we were down in the Carolinas. And the clothing on me started to come off layer after layer. My mother would take a layer off as we got a little bit further south, a little layer off as we get a little bit further south, another layer off as we get a little bit further south, and warmer and warmer and warmer. Got down to the Carolinas and there wasn't any snow at all. And I had most of the layers of clothing off of me, just a little jacket, So, still wasn't pooping good. Still having a hard time of it, And so we got down to Florida, and my grandmother and grandfather was just overjoyed to see us. And she was like, come on in, she said to me, and took me into the house, and she said, here, start eating these oranges, she said. She had these, and the Florida oranges back in those days, they were not like the oranges we have today. The oranges we have today, are like, they pick them green. These oranges were tree ripened, they're sweet and juicy, and she started feeding me these oranges. But what I really noticed as a kid was the colors. When you get down to Florida, it wasn't like it was in Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, it was grays and snow colors and dark, and the sun would come up in the morning and set, and you only get a few hours of light each day, and it was like a gray, dark tomb. And when I got down there in Florida, it was bright and sunny, and the colors popped out on all the trees, and the trailer park was absolutely beautiful. It had every trailer was painted a different color. They were every color of the rainbow, and then they had these little patios in front where they had all these flowers, and croton bushes were one of their favorites, and they had all these different kinds of flower bushes and everything on the front porches. And a little paved road that ran all the way through the trailer park, like in a circle, went around. They had their own little, it was called Pete's Trailer Park, and it was in Hollywood, Florida, and that's where we went, to my grandfather and grandmother's trailer. So my grandmother, she started to feed me all these oranges and things, And my mother, she got me this little suit. She got me on the way someplace. She'd stop and got me this little suit. And what it was a pair of green short pants and a little green shirt that she could tuck in, and a little belt, you know, and I had all these pockets in the pants. I had about 10 pairs of pockets in the pants, And so she got me a little pair of sandals and everything else, and it was a cute little outfit she got me, and so it felt so much better than being dressed in all those thick, heavy clothes and everything. And I started to feel better almost right away. All those oranges, and I guess I was getting over the flus anyway. So I started to gain a little bit of weight, and my bowels started to function again. It wasn't long after that, and I started to come out of it and started to get my health back a little bit. It felt so much better though, And so my dad, he was right on. He was like, "What's next?" He says, "Here we are," and he was staying in my grandfather's trailer. Now my grandfather's trailer, it was one of those old, not like back in the days when they had the double wides or anything. This was a single wide trailer. I think it was like 8 feet wide. And it had, in one end, it had one bedroom. It had a hallway and a little bathroom with a shower, a toilet, and a sink, And then the hallway went to a living room. And the living room went to the kitchen. The kitchen was like adjoined on. The kitchen was in the very front of the trailer. It had a stove and a refrigerator and everything else, right? My grandfather was so proud of his trailer, he paid $400 for it. Bought it outright, belonged to him totally. And he had it parked at Pete's and paying $25 a month. But my grandfather was making like $200 or more a month. So back in those days, that was a lot of money, I was living the life of Riley because of all that money he was making, my grandfather. So he said to my dad, he says, "You stay here as long as you want," to my dad. But what it was my dad was a little bit like, he didn't like to see his family having to stay with my grandfather and grandmother. It was okay for a couple weeks, but my dad wasn't happy with that. And what happened was we were having to, I guess my parents were basically sleeping in where the couch was in the living room of the trailer, my grandfather's trailer. But it was okay because everybody got along good and everything, but very tight quarters for a family of that many people, 5 people, in that little trailer. I think the trailer was only it might have been 35 or 40 feet long and about 8 feet wide, something like that. It wasn't a real big trailer or anything. So my dad, he wasn't, just after a couple days, I think it was only about 4 days or something, my dad was right on to go out and find a job. So he went out and he started looking. Being he was an auto body mechanic and a welder, and my dad was really hunting, going to everybody. He's got a job here, got a job there. No, they might need some help over at the dealership. Dad went to the first dealership. No. Don't need any men right now, but let me get your name and number and whatever. He started to go through that kind of stuff. But it wasn't long. He only went to about 3 or 4 dealerships. And Miami Lincoln Mercury said, "Okay, we'll hire you on. We'll try you out. Give you a shot." So my dad started working there. And it worked out really good. And they moved immediately when they got my dad. They knew they had a good man, And they said, "Hey, we got a good man here. We'll move him up, And that's what they did. So it wasn't very long. I mean, my dad was making $300 a week, even more than my grandfather, and working for Miami Lincoln Mercury, repairing cars that had been smashed. These big old Lincoln Continentals, stuff like that. You know what I mean? 1968 models, 1967, 66 models. The great big bumpers they had on them and stuff. My dad used to complain. He used to come home and say, "Oh, why do they make those bumpers so big and heavy? Put all that chrome on them," to my mother and stuff, And so it wasn't very long. As soon as my dad got that job, I think it was at the second week, my dad saved up his pay, $300 a week, and he went out and bought his own trailer. and parked it near my grandfather's trailer at Pete's. Now, I can't remember what color my grandfather's trailer was. I think it was blue. I'm not sure. I think my dad got some sort of a pinkish color one, an orangish. I think it was orange. What my dad got. But it was a nice little trailer. I think it was a little bit bigger than my grandfather's trailer. But I think he paid $400 for it, which was a bit more than 1 week's wage. He totally bought the whole thing. You know? And also, my dad had purchased a car that he hadn't, I don't think he'd fully paid for it, from my uncle. Went to take to Florida. And my dad paid that off too, what he owed on that car. And just that quick, you know? And plus he's putting money away because the rent was only $25 a month there at Pete's. So really, to be honest, America was absolutely the land of opportunity. It was the most wonderful country on earth. It was a land where if you wanted to work, there was plenty of jobs available, and taxes were low, government services were good, the roads were being built in that era, not turning into potholes like they are now. And America was really the land of opportunity, and so they had everything there at near Pete's Trailer Park, within walking distance. Down one side of the road there was IHOP, and down the other side of the road there was a place called Lum's. My parents would like to go to. My uncle and my dad later on when my uncle moved there, but this was early on, before my uncle moved down. My dad used to like to go to a place called Lum's because they could get a beer, with a hot dog and fries or whatever, And there was, I think, Hardee's. There was Kentucky Fried Chicken, all within walking distance. Burger King, that was one of my favorites, Burger King. And the burgers back then, they were the size of a platter, honest to goodness. And strawberry shakes that were made from real ice cream that was like whipped up, and it's just a wonderful time, I remember back then, when the breeze used to come off the ocean, oftentimes when they get done work, My parents and my grandparents, they get done work around the same time, my dad and everything, and they'd all decide to go for an evening meal. My grandparents, my mother and my father and everybody. They'd drive down to one of the shopping malls, and girls would hop out of the car. Say girls, my grandmother and my mother, I remember my grandfather, he'd give my grandmother like $2. He'd say, like, here's $2, and he'd say, don't spend it all in one place. Ha, 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 Now, that don't sound like nothing nowadays, $2. But back in those days, if a woman was shopping around, it would be like giving them $40 now. It's quite seriously, And she'd already have a bit of money, but he'd give her a little bit more, And I remember the breeze. I remember one evening in particular they were doing that. Everybody was going to go out to eat. And we did this quite often, but I remember one evening in particular. It was about 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the evening. It'd been a warm day all day, like in the 80s. Remember the heat coming off of the pavement. I remember everybody there in a absolutely joyous mood, you know what I mean? Like, gonna go shopping and then we're gonna go out to eat, sort of thing. And I think I was about 6 years old. And my grandmother and grandfather, and the breeze. I remember the breeze hitting me. It's one thing in particular I remember, the ocean breeze coming off the ocean, and it was absolutely balmy. It had a balmy feel to it. It wasn't a harsh wind, it was a soft wind, and it was rather delightful. So I have very fond memories of that period in time back in the 1960s, back when things were really good. And anyway, that's you guys' story for this week. Now, next week I'm going to continue on and stories about Florida, and thank you guys for listening. Like and subscribe to my channel, and we'll catch you guys in the next show. Bye-bye.